In 1954, the Supreme Court made its ruling in the Brown versus Topeka Board of Education case, one of the most important cases in the history of the court. I mentioned the Plessy versus Ferguson case previously. If that case is important, I think Brown is even a notch more important, because in fact the Brown decision overturned Plessy versus Ferguson and the idea of separate but equal. The object in question were the schools, public schools, and the question of separate but equal facilities in the schools. And the Brown decision ruled that separate schools and separate facilities, by their very nature, are not equal. Even if on the surface the facilities and the buildings and so on appear to be equal, they cannot be equal. And so Plessy was struck down, separate but equal was struck down, and the courts ordered that segregated schools all around the country begin the process of desegregation. And so the next day, students went to schools and white and black students sat side by side, right? No, of course not. The next day, nothing had changed. The next month, nothing had changed. And in fact, in some cases, years went by and nothing changed. It's always been a challenge of the Supreme Court that it can make its rulings on the constitutionality of this or that decision, but it requires action on the ground level to actually make the changes. I recall Andrew Jackson's famous comment regarding Cherokee removal and the Indians. When the Supreme Court made a decision in favor of the Native Americans, Andrew Jackson said something to the effect of, "The Supreme Court has made its decision, now let's see them enforce it." And he went on to ignore the Supreme Court's decision. And so the challenge in the wake of the Brown decision came to be the actual process of desegregation. The ruling has been made, but the process took years to implement. And as I described to you in the previous slide, each school everywhere around the country had its Jackie Robinson, had its first black student. Oftentimes, it was thought to be preferable to have a group of black students being the first rather than just one on his or her own. And so in the case of Arkansas and the high school known as Little Rock Central High, this process was really brought to a head in 1957. So Little Rock had kind of laid out a plan that was going to take a couple years, but the agreement was in fall 1957 the first black students would be admitted. And there were 9 of them, and so they came to be known as the Little Rock Nine. The governor of Arkansas famously objected to this. His name was Orville Faubus. And Faubus actually ordered the National Guard to prevent the 9 students from entering Central High School on that first day. And actually, the first day, the atmosphere was so heated that the word had gone out that the students should not attempt to go to school that day. But one student, Melba Beals, who is pictured in this picture, literally failed to get the message, and so she attempted to go to school and ended up being the only one, and she found herself surrounded by this very angry mob. As she commented later, they moved closer and closer. Somebody started yelling. I tried to see a friendly face somewhere in the crowd, someone who maybe could help. I looked into the face of an old woman, and it seemed a kind face. But when I looked at her again, she spat on me. And you kind of get that sense from this picture that they are surrounded by just this ruthless and vicious white mob. President Dwight Eisenhower intervened in this case. He actually federalized the Arkansas National Guard, meaning that the troops that the governor had sent, Eisenhower sent them away. He has the power to do that, and instead sent the 101st Airborne Division to accompany the Little Rock Nine to school. And so it took an armed escort to get those students into the school. This is perhaps the most dramatic instance of desegregating schools in the country, certainly one of the most dramatic. But there were similar kinds of episodes in many different schools around the country. Parents were reluctant to make change. Students were reluctant to make change. Administrators, governors were reluctant to make change. And so in many, many cases, it had to be forced upon them, meaning that the process was a very difficult, awkward, confrontation-filled, and even dangerous one for those involved. The Brown decision is just the first in a long series of what may be familiar events that we come to know as the Civil Rights Movement. And the change pretty rapidly moves beyond just the school system. Momentum seems to finally be building around the country to force change through all elements of society. One of the other familiar events in this sequence is the protest of Rosa Parks. In December of 1955, Rosa Parks, who was a 42-year-old black seamstress in Montgomery, Alabama, was sitting in a seat in the black section on the bus, but as the bus filled up, she was asked to move further back so that whites could have her seat. She refused to do so and was arrested and booked, as you see there at the bottom. There had been protests similar to this before. There had been moments when people refused to move. But this one sparked a movement, and there are a number of different reasons for it, one of which is that Rosa Parks was a member of the NAACP. She was well positioned to make a kind of protest like this, and in fact there had been discussions about an opportunity to make a protest like that. And so Rosa Parks had something of a following when she made that protest. And so what followed is known as the Montgomery bus boycott, where blacks in Montgomery refused to ride the buses as long as they were segregated. And blacks made up as much as 80% of the bus passengers in that era. So losing their business was crippling to the transportation system. This also brought onto the scene the leadership of Martin Luther King Jr., who happened to be the pastor at the Dexter Baptist Church, which was centrally located for the participants in the boycott, and they asked if they could use his church as kind of an organizing area and a staging area. They would have meetings there, and Martin Luther King rapidly moved to the forefront of the civil rights movement. If there is any figure that you've already learned about and know about, it is Martin Luther King Jr. So I won't belabor you with more details about his background and upbringing, other than to say that it is either an incredible stroke of good fortune or divine intervention or whatever else you want to refer to it, stroke of luck that Martin Luther King happened to be the pastor at that church in that place at that time, because he may be the perfect person for the perfect episode in history. His background in the teachings of Gandhi, his insistence on nonviolence, his willingness to sacrifice and go to jail, all of these are qualities that made him really the perfect leader for the civil rights movement at that time. And we will come back in later lectures and talk about some of the later elements of the civil rights movement. The final example that I want to mention now, before moving on to other chapters, is the lunch counter sit-ins, which were initiated in 1960 in Greensboro, North Carolina. In this era, it was common for drugstores like Walgreens or stores like Woolworths to have a lunch counter in the back where people could get simple meals or milkshakes or something like that. And these lunch counters typically were segregated. Either blacks were not allowed, or there was a separate place where they could sit, or a separate entrance that they could use. And so this became a target for the civil rights movement. And beginning in Greensboro in 1960, a group of blacks you see in the lower left-hand picture, that's the first sit-in, it's actually the second day, but the first sit-in, simply sat at the lunch counter and requested to be served, and then just simply waited. So it's nonviolent protest, but the response was frequently violent. And this kind of protest spread to other areas of the South. And as you look at the other picture on the right-hand side, you see that once word began to spread out that these kind of protests were going on, frequently they were met with white mobs, very angry white mobs, who could react at times with violence. Let me read you the description by one young woman who participated in a sit-in. We can imagine her as one of the women sitting in that picture on the right. The boy lifted Joan from the counter by her waist and carried her outside the store. Simultaneously, I was snatched from my stool by two white high school students. I was dragged about 30 feet toward the door by my hair when someone made them turn me loose. As I was getting up off the floor, I saw Joan coming back inside. We started back to the center of the counter to join Perlina. Lois Chafee, a white Tougaloo faculty member, was now sitting next to her. So Joan and I just climbed across the rope at the front end of the counter and sat down. There were now 4 of us, 2 whites and 2 Negroes, all women. The mob started smearing us with ketchup, mustard, sugar, pies, and everything on the counter. Soon Joan and I were joined by John Salter, but the moment he sat down, he was hit on the jaw with what appeared to be brass knuckles. Blood gushed from his face, and someone threw salt into the open wound. So this is the kind of response that we might see to those sit-ins. But gradually, as with the Montgomery bus boycott, where eventually the buses are desegregated, gradually the lunch counters are desegregated. Store owners can't have these violent mobs day after day destroying their store, ruining their goods, and wrecking their business. And so gradually the lunch counters begin to desegregate. And this establishes the pattern for the civil rights movement. Change is brought in. Slow, gradual, often at great price, at great personal sacrifice. There are many individuals who are injured and some even killed throughout this process, but eventually the barriers start to come down.